Covering Donald Trump has always been complicated, no more so than when his political attacks take on violent connotations, like a recent video he shared on Truth Social showing an image of President Joe Biden tied up in the back of a pickup truck. When a former president who incited a violent riot with violent rhetoric after the last election starts sending potentially dangerous messages again, how can the media respond responsibly? I'm joined now by NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik and Lyla Alphonse, the New Hampshire and Rhode Island editor for the Boston Globe and the former managing editor of U.S. News and World Report. Thank you both for being here. David, former President Trump has a long history of saying things that other presidents never would have said. Do you think that sharing this particular image of President Biden is yet another example of that, or has a new line been crossed here?
I don't know. Can I go with both?
Absolutely.
I feel as though this is deeply problematic. From a political standpoint, you can see it as more, as we use the phrase kind of euphemistically without thinking, red meat for the hardcore Trump supporter, trying to activate them, trying to get them out, trying to make Biden into something of a joke. But think about what red meat is. It's essentially a destroyed flesh that was a body at one point. And what you see in that image is a sitting president of the United States, a person, living person, essentially hog-tied in the back of a pickup truck as though that's something to be hooted at, hollered at, and cheered. Essentially a threat against a president, if taken with any credibility, is often investigated by the Secret Service. When Kathy Griffin did that with a mask of Trump covered, I guess, in ketchup or paint some years ago, she was investigated and became, kind of taboo, even in Hollywood, even in a place of a hotbed of anti-Trump sentiment. And this is not just cavalier, but truly intentionally repugnant, suggesting that there be violence done to one's political enemies. I think that there is cause to, I think you're asking to, should we still be reproducing this, right? Should we still be showing this in some ways? And I think in some ways there is cause to do so gently and briefly, as you just did, so that people can evaluate it for themselves. But it is part of our rhetoric in our time.
Lyla, I'd like to get your take on that question of how we should report on something like this. Do you think that an image like this should be shown as we report on what the former president did? Should we describe it in vivid terms without actually showing it, because showing it amplifies it, disseminates the message the former president is seeking to put out there? What do you think the right calculus is?
I think this is a great example of how the media is not a monolith, actually. You look at the different outlets and how they've treated this story. AP had a very straightforward, this is a description, this was a video of a truck on a highway. I personally have seen a similar decal on the back of a truck that showed a woman tied up in the back. So this is something that is out there. ABC News had 5 bylines on their story, so they threw a lot of resources at it. Al Jazeera just described very plainly what they were going to have in their segment. Personally, I think this is something where you're caught between, like, do we show this image, which is obviously meant to incite a very emotional and strong response, or do we ignore it? And we're caught in another trap of, this is the former president. When the former president says something, you need to consider whether or not it's newsworthy. You need to consider whether or not you're going to let people know it happened. I think there's a fine line that can't be crossed between amplifying the message and informing people about what the former president has said. And it's really tough to do both. I personally would not show the image. I personally would describe it, though. And I would describe it, not the image in detail, but I would offer as much context as I could. This was on the back of a pickup truck. This was an image that was painted or a decal on the truck. This, I don't believe I've heard that it was something that was manufactured by the Trump campaign. I believe it was video that was captured. I haven't
heard any indication of that either.
So that's something, that's context that I think is valuable.
That's a good point. I want to ask David about his take on what the calculus should be. But before I do that, let's just take a quick look at the way a few different outlets, CNN, I believe CBS, and MSNBC, the way that they approached this and grappled with the questions that we're talking about here.
This was captured on Thursday on Long Island. It shows two trucks traveling on the road, decked out in Trump flags and decals. And on the second truck, there is a picture of Joe Biden tied up, hog-tied, as you said.
On Friday, Trump posted on social media a video depicting an effigy of President Biden bound and restrained in the back of a pickup truck. We are choosing not to show you that video.
The former president shared an image of President Biden bound and restrained in the back of a pickup truck.
So, David, Lyla was offering her take on the considerations that we should weigh and maybe the approaches that should be used. How do you see the calculus around sharing abhorrent, maybe, messages that are being disseminated by the former president? What should we make a point of doing, and what should we avoid doing?
Well, what you don't want to do is be yanked this way and that way by whatever impulse Trump and his campaign is indulging at that moment, and whatever at this moment, inflammatory rhetoric or imagery they're using. You don't want to just be sort of constant humdrum of chasing them. When there's the perception, as I think you articulated up front, about the idea of a line being crossed, and the idea of something that if another person were to do it, as apparently this driver did, it may be something that gets looked at. I think it's within probably the bounds of the First Amendment. But, with the sitting president, there are additional implications written into the law at the moment. I think it's worth looking at. And there are times where, and this may be one of them, where some news outlets will do well to present it. You notice MSNBC is not doing that. Its audience, of course, leans sharply left, very favorable to the president, and very unlikely to show something that degrading about him. That said, I think there are moments where the framing matters, the language matters, how long you do it, how many times you do it. There are ways in which, just as we heard from Lyla, that the choices you make are important. It's not simply a blanket, slap that thing on and show it every hour on the hour. It's measured and contained and controlled so we understand what we're talking about. Online you can often have warning signs, what we now call trigger warnings, right? Where you say this may be disturbing, click on it. There are ways to decide how to distribute this. What we need to understand is what is actually happening. If this is okay with a certain sector of the American society, we need to be aware of that too. We can't completely avert our eyes.
I have to say, for what it's worth, I like the idea of finding a way to show it at least once, just so that people can get the fullest possible sense of what the image is if they want to. And I also like the idea of maximizing context, like you said, Lyla, and David, couching it, perhaps offering a trigger warning, not making it a nonstop, every hour, top of the hour, there it is again, thinking through the presentation.
And if you looked at that word on CBS, they had a caption online. It said controversial. I think we understand it's beyond controversial. This is incendiary, inflammatory, violent. Like, we need to acknowledge what it is, even in our captioning when you deal with such a thing.
Completely agree. I think sometimes we try to protect ourselves by couching the caption because you don't want to say something is offensive in case maybe it's not to some viewers. But in this case, I liked how they showed the truck that was in front first with just the flags. You realize that this was an incident that happened out in the wild, so to speak. And I mean, let's face it, some people are terrible. I mean, there are people who will be very supportive of this, but I think not showing that little bit of context or not describing it lets you imagine things that are maybe different than what the reality actually was.
That's a really good
point. Just 10 seconds on this, Adam.
Yeah.
We need to distinguish between acknowledging what this is and thinking that makes a news organization pro-Trump or anti-Trump.
Right.
This is not about pro-Trump or anti-Trump. This is about focusing with clarity on the specifics of this incident, of this episode, the implications of it, what it says about us and the moment. And yes, it reflects on the campaign and the candidate, and people get to evaluate that for themselves. But it doesn't take sides on a party or a candidate to be precise and fair in providing an accurate representation of what actually occurred.
I want to switch gears here and talk about another topic that is in the news involving politics and media. Israel has passed a law that would give the country the authority to basically stop the network Al Jazeera from operating in Israel. Al Jazeera has been aggressively covering the war in Gaza. They're one of only a few outlets that have been able to do that. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Al Jazeera is a terror channel that effectively facilitated the October 7th attack, and that he wants to use this new law to ban the network. Lyla, what do you make of this? What's going on here? Is this another example of the Israeli government trying to control the narrative coming out of Gaza, which we've seen them do before, or is there something new afoot?
Personally, it seems to me like it's another aspect of trying to control the message, not just the media, but the message overall and the messaging. The law is on the books. It has not been implemented yet, which makes this feel kind of like a get in line, otherwise I'll stop you from broadcasting here. But I think that in general, regimes that are in the middle of doing something that is unpopular do not like it when independent media shows what's going on the ground. And I think that that's what we're seeing happening here in the effort to control what is coming out of Israel.
David, Al Jazeera has run into trouble not just with the Israeli government before. I should mention, by the way, this is a significant point that Israel has actually, the Israeli military has killed and injured multiple journalists from Al Jazeera, both prior to the war in Gaza and during the war in Gaza. There are disputed narratives. Al Jazeera says that one of their, for example, a correspondent of theirs was targeted and intentionally killed before the war in Gaza. The Israeli government says it was accidental. So that's context worth putting out there. That being said, David, Al Jazeera has run into trouble with Arab governments in the past, as well as with the Israeli government. Is there something about Al Jazeera's MO that makes them a lightning rod when it comes to governments trying to impede their operation?
I think actually in some ways it's that Al Jazeera is capable of doing some very good, independent and fair-minded reporting that makes them perhaps most threatening to the Netanyahu government, or particularly the prime minister himself. I do think there can be some truth to the idea that particularly there are differences between how Al Jazeera comports itself and reports in English and how it does so in Arabic. I also think that Netanyahu and the Israeli interests are most likely to be represented fairly in Arabic-speaking countries by Al Jazeera than almost any other source. Not that the AP or other Western-based outlets aren't capable of doing that, but just that they are trusted in a lot of these places. They have come under attack by a number of autocratic Arab regimes because they do some independent reporting there. These are laws, like, let's remember, Israel has declared war. It's a time of war. We haven't in the United States fought a war on our soil really since World War II. And so it matters that we haven't declared war since then in the conflicts in which we've engaged in a conventional sense, because we don't have censorship laws and rules that come into effect to quite that degree here domestically. And, Israel in a time of war can do that, and they can say, look, this is the way countries wage war. In Ukraine, there are certain kinds of limitations on press as well. However, you have this very interesting wrinkle. Actually, a number of them, it seems to me, in this moment, where you have Netanyahu doing something that has attracted world criticism and condemnation to varying degrees. You have a populace in Israel that was increasingly hostile to him before the October 7th deadly terrorist attacks, and has become so again because of his seeming intent to pursue military destruction as opposed to figuring out a way to negotiate the release of Israeli hostages. And this is very uncomfortable. It's a way of sort of signaling, well, this is our problem, is we're getting bad press from inside the country. We'll go after it. I do think he's likely to get the most fair hearing from Al Jazeera, even if it's unwelcome. And I will say the Israeli journalistic tradition is to incorporate a lot of different voices, including uncomfortable voices, including, I would have said before October, voices of Hamas in op-eds of pages of major Israeli newspapers like Haaretz. So, the idea of having these other voices is not unfamiliar to the Israeli experience. What Netanyahu is saying is increasingly hunkering down and showing a kind of autocratic spirit.
Lyla, last word for you. The Israeli government's been criticized throughout this war for its treatment of journalists. I believe about 90 have been killed, 90 Palestinian journalists, a couple of Israeli journalists. Given that the waging of the war is already this hotly contested topic, is there anything that media organizations or governments you think should do in response to this proposed ban on Al Jazeera?
I think they should speak out and call for protection of the journalists. I think that the proposed ban of Al Jazeera actually says a lot more about the countries that want to ban it, because it's not just Israel, than it does about Al Jazeera themselves. I would say that organizations should continue to try their best to get actual information about what's going on on the ground in Israel, on the ground in Gaza, and to fairly report what they see, because what they're getting from different government entities isn't the whole picture.
Yeah. All right. Lyla Alphonse, David Folkenflik, thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank you.